Diane was crying alone in our living room while our son laughed in the kitchen with people I'd never let past my front door. I was supposed to be gone until tomorrow. Instead, I came home a day early, turned my key in the lock, and walked into the wreckage of my own family. My name is Louis Coleman. I'm 69, a retired architect, and for 20 years I let my only son believe I was a simple old man scraping by on a pension. I let him believe it because I loved him. That night, I found out exactly what that lie had cost me. The house was too quiet when I walked in. Then I heard Diane's muffled sobbing from the sofa we'd bought in 1985. Before I could ask what was wrong, laughter rolled out of my kitchen. Sharp, aristocratic, expensive laughter that didn't belong in my home. I walked in and found my son Terrell holding a tape measure, while his wife Heather's parents, Richard and Barbara Preston, sipped my whiskey and discussed knocking out my kitchen wall for a marble island. They were mid-renovation of a house that wasn't theirs, planning it like I was already dead. "Terrell," I said. He dropped the tape measure like it burned him. I asked him why his mother was crying alone while he entertained guests I'd never invited. Heather answered for him, cool, entitled, like she was explaining something obvious to a slow child. They were moving in. The house was going to be Terrell's anyway, so why wait? Diane and I could take the guest room in the basement. At our age, she said, we didn't really need the space. I looked at my son and gave him one chance to be the man I raised. Tell them to leave. Instead, he broke. He told me I was embarrassing him, that the house was too much for us, that he was tired of worrying about my bills. He said it was his house now, his decision. That was the moment my son died in front of me, and a stranger wearing his face stood there instead. Something in me went cold and very quiet. I didn't yell. I walked to the closet, took out Diane's coat, and helped her into it, while Terrell sputtered questions. Then I looked at all of them and said, "You said you were taking over, so take over." I walked my wife out the front door and locked it behind us. I didn't call a taxi. I called my car service, and a spotless black Lincoln pulled up in under 2 minutes. The first crack in the story Terrell thought he knew about his father. I checked us into the Four Seasons, into the presidential suite, and the night manager greeted me by name like an old friend, because he was one. Diane stood in the marble-floored living room, terrified, asking how any of this was possible. So I told her the truth I'd hidden for 20 years. When I sold my architectural firm and my patent portfolio at 55, I didn't retire modestly. I walked away with $24 million. I put $20 million into a trust I built specifically to survive exactly this kind of ambush. It had grown to $35 million. I'd paid for Terrell's college, his first apartment, always calling it the last of my savings, because I wanted him to learn the value of a dollar instead of the weight of a number. I thought I was protecting him from becoming soft. Instead, I'd only hidden the target on my back. Then I told her the part that mattered most that night. The house wasn't ours. It never had been. It belonged to the Coleman family trust. We were tenants in our own home, and Terrell had just tried to evict the landlord. I called George Patterson, my real attorney, at 3 in the morning. 2 words were enough. "It's time." He asked if I was certain. I told him what Terrell had done, and he said, "Consider it done. I want him cut off by morning," and hung up already in motion. The next day, in George's glass tower office overlooking the city, he handed me a report that turned my stomach. Terrell and Heather were $750,000 in debt. Heather's spending outpaced their income by hundreds of thousands a year, all of it propped up by loans, maxed cards, and a lifestyle they couldn't afford, all to impress her parents. That explained the desperation. But George had worse news. 3 months earlier, Terrell and Richard Preston had walked into my bank with their own lawyer and tried to have me declared mentally incompetent, to seize emergency control of the trust. The bank had laughed them out and quietly called George. I'd built a clause into the trust for exactly this scenario, years ago, praying I'd never need it. Clause 7B, the wolf in sheep's clothing clause. Any beneficiary who committed willful financial, emotional, or physical harm against Diane or me would be permanently, irrevocably disinherited. Terrell had triggered it the moment he sat down in that bank. He just didn't know it yet. Which meant when they failed to steal $35 million, They'd come back the next night to steal a $500,000 house instead. And when that failed too, the money would go to the person I'd already named as contingent heir, my niece Monique, a public school nurse in Atlanta who called Diane every single Sunday and had flown in on her own dime to sit at her hospital bedside for 3 days without being asked. We built the trap. I called Terrell, let my voice crack with defeat, and told him he was right. Diane and I couldn't fight this anymore. We'd sign the house over. Come to the lawyer's office at 2. Bring Heather. Bring her parents as witnesses. His relief was immediate and revolting. They arrived dressed for a coronation. George slid over a stack of documents, a care and property transfer agreement. Heather signed without reading a word. Terrell signed just as fast. Richard and Barbara proudly signed as witnesses on a page that, buried in careful legal language, had them attesting under oath that Lewis and Diane Coleman were of diminished capacity and required supervision. They thought they were cementing a victory. They were signing a confession. The moment the pens went down, I told them there was a small problem. I didn't own the house. It belonged to the trust, a trust currently valued, George said, at just over $35 million. The silence that followed was the best sound I'd heard in years. Heather's horror flipped instantly into hysterical joy. "We're rich!" before I told her the truth. Terrell wasn't rich. He was disqualified. Clause 7B had already stripped him of everything, 3 months and 1 bank meeting ago, and their performance last night in my kitchen had only sealed it. He got nothing, not the house, not a penny. Richard tried to bluster about coercion and lawsuits. George reminded him the document was already legally binding and that they'd signed a notarized confession of exactly the fraud they'd just committed. Then I pressed the intercom and called in Monique, standing quietly in scrubs, and told the room she was now the sole heir to the entire estate. Terrell's face collapsed. He demanded to know why a part-time nurse outranked his own blood. I told him the truth. She was my family. Blood hadn't earned that word. She had. Monique laid an eviction notice on the table. 24 hours to clear their belongings, locks changing the moment the clock ran out. Heather lunged, and George stepped calmly into her path, reminding her that assault charges stacked nicely on top of conspiracy to commit elder fraud. Then George turned the screen on, and the real collapse began. He walked the room through Terrell's secret gambling debt. $750,000 bled out through offshore betting sites, hidden from Heather behind a story about one bad business loan. Heather turned on him in real time, screaming, backing away like he was contaminated. Then George turned the same light on the Prestons. Richard's hedge fund was under active SEC investigation for running what amounted to a Ponzi scheme, and Barbara had been quietly draining her own 88-year-old mother's retirement account. The room dissolved into pure, ugly recrimination. Richard calling his wife a thief, Barbara calling him a fraud, Heather calling Terrell worthless. It wasn't a family anymore. It was 4 liars discovering they'd been lying to each other the whole time, too. Heather turned on Terrell with the coldest line of the night. She'd only ever loved the money, and he'd been too stupid to even inherit it correctly. He pulled off his wedding ring, dropped it at her feet, and told her it was over. She threw her ring at his head and stormed out with her parents, calling him a broke, pathetic failure on her way through the door. Richard paused at the threshold long enough to accuse me of enjoying their humiliation. I told him the truth. I hadn't planned their downfall. They had. I just had a better emergency exit. That left Terrell alone on the floor, sobbing, 38 years old and utterly wrecked. George told him it wasn't over. Conspiracy to commit elder fraud, attempted bank fraud, forgery, felony elder abuse, all backed by a signed confession and bank surveillance. Prison, with a mandatory minimum. Terrell fell to his knees, grabbing at my suit, begging. I asked him one question. Would a son really try to have his father declared insane? He already knew the answer. He'd given it to me himself, the night before. Diane stopped the sentencing before George could finish. She stood over her son and asked him the only question that mattered. Why? Why us? What had we ever done to deserve being thrown away? And the truth poured out of him, uglier than any of his lies. He'd spent his whole life ashamed of us, ashamed of the modest house, the old car, the coupon clipping, the frugal life he'd learned to call poor the moment he met people with real money. He'd told Heather we were secretly wealthy, just to have something to offer her. Every lie after that was just him trying to keep the first one alive, one loan at a time, until he decided the fastest fix was cutting us out entirely. Diane slapped him, hard, once, for every sleepless night he'd caused her. Then she pulled his head to her chest and held him while he broke completely, because he was still, impossibly, her son. I gave him 2 paths, prison, and we never spoke again. Or 4 conditions, non-negotiable. Inpatient treatment for his gambling addiction. A job, any job, and every paycheck going toward paying back the $750,000 to the trust, never to us, because his inheritance was gone forever. A permanent restraining order, cutting the Prestons and Heather out of his life entirely. And a punishment. He would move home, not as our son, but as our tenant. Living in the very basement he'd tried to banish us to. Working as the property's live-in handyman until his debt was paid in sweat instead of money. He accepted without hesitation. A month later, the house didn't feel like a crime scene anymore. Monique and her husband David moved into the upstairs guest rooms. She was 6 months pregnant, and the news pulled Diane back to life, filling the kitchen with baking smells I hadn't caught in years. Terrell came home from his 30-day program thin and quiet, all the arrogance burned out of him. Every evening at 6:15 I'd watch him cross the yard from his hardware store shift, covered in drywall dust, and disappear into the basement. He ate alone. We didn't speak. One evening I went down anyway, told him the kitchen faucet was leaking and needed fixing. The old defiance flickered in his eyes for half a second and died. "Okay," he said. As I turned to leave, I told him without looking back that Diane had saved him a plate of the chicken he liked. I heard him choke out a thank you behind me. I told him plainly, for the first time in your life, you're doing this on your own, and left him with his tools. 2 weeks after that, George called with the rest of the reckoning. Richard Preston had been arrested on his golf course. The SEC case had turned into a full Ponzi scheme charge, 20 years minimum. Barbara was wiped out, every asset seized, living out of a motel, and had the nerve to demand the trust cover her legal fees. George sent her a bill instead. Heather had tried to gut Terrell in the divorce for alimony, certain the millions were hidden somewhere, until George produced his hardware store pay stubs and his basement lease. Her lawyer quit for non-payment. She walked away with nothing but her name and, according to George's last update, was already circling a 90-year-old widower at a museum gala. 6 months in, Sunday dinner at 124 Willow Creek didn't feel like a performance anymore. David told stories that made Diane really laugh. Monique, 8 months pregnant, argued paint colors for the nursery. And at the end of the table sat Terrell, quieter, calloused hands, no longer the center of anything, just part of the family again, in the smallest possible way. He'd fixed the attic insulation without being asked. Nobody made a show of thanking him. It was enough that they did. After dinner, I sat on the porch in my father's old rocking chair. Terrell came out and stood in front of me, nervous, holding 2 envelopes. The first was thick, his full paycheck, $500, for Monique and David's baby. The second was thin, $100. The first payment on a debt of $750,000. He said he knew the math. At that rate it would take 600 years. He said it anyway, and didn't look away from the truth of it. I put that $100 envelope in my shirt pocket, right over my heart, and told him 1 payment down. He told me the faucet didn't drip anymore. I told him that was good work. He said goodnight and walked back to the basement, and for the first time, his shoulders were straight. I sat out there a long while after he'd gone, listening to Diane and Monique laughing over the dishes. I hadn't gotten my son back, not the one I'd raised, not the sharp, easy, dishonest man who'd stood in my kitchen and told me to accept the basement. That man was gone for good, and I'd been the one to end him. But sitting there with $100 folded over my heart, I understood I hadn't lost everything in that trade. I'd lost the son I thought I wanted, and found, slowly, 1 leaking faucet and 1 thin envelope at a time, the man I'd always needed him to become.